Hello, chess lovers! Welcome back to the Chess Ventura channel. In this video, we'll be analyzing a tactical game by the legendary Mikhail Tal, who faced an opponent utilizing a Fianchetto setup. In this game, we will learn how Tal's signature tactics and sacrificial strategies dismantled the Fianchetto bishop structure. Let's jump right into the match between Mikhail Tal and Zoltan Ribli, played in 1985. Here, Tal played as black, while his opponent began with the move knight to f3, which Tal answered with pawn to d5. White responded with pawn to g3, preparing a fianchetto of the bishop on g2. Black then developed the bishop to g4, White positioned the bishop on g2, and Black followed with pawn to c6. Subsequently, White played pawn to b3, intending to fianchetto the dark squared bishop on b2, and Tal responded with knight to d7. White continued with bishop to b2, while Black connected his knights with knight to f6. At this stage, White had a pair of fianchettoed bishops, which often pose significant challenges to Black. Let's see how Mikhail Tal dismantled these fianchettoed bishops. White castled kingside, and in response, Tal advanced pawn to e6. This move aimed to reinforce the central pawn structure while opening a diagonal for his bishop. White followed with the natural move, pawn to d3, preparing to challenge the center with pawn to e4 or pawn to c4. Tal replied with bishop to c5, creating space for the king to castle and shadowing the white king. White developed the knight to d2, and after Black castled kingside, White began attacking the central pawns with pawn to e4. At this critical point, Black needed to be cautious of White's pawn advances. For instance, if Black played pawn to h6, White could push the pawn forward to attack the knight. After the knight retreats to h7, White's pawn to d4 would threaten Black's bishop. Black's bishop to e7, followed by White's pawn to c4, would grant White control over the dark squares, significantly restricting Black's piece mobility. So, Tal did not want to take any risks. He immediately exchanged pawns on e4, which White recaptured with a pawn. Tal then advanced pawn to e5 to prevent White from pushing their pawn forward to attack the knight. This was a critical move for Black, because if Tal had played something like rook to e8, White could have played pawn to e5, attacking the knight. After the knight moved to d5, White's knight could occupy the comfortable square on e4, working alongside the pawn to control the dark squares d6 and f6. Naturally, Tal preempted this by playing pawn to e5. White then pushed pawn to h3, driving away Black's light-squared bishop. The idea was that if the bishop no longer pinned the knight, White could win Black's pawn. Tal responded by exchanging the bishop for the knight, and White recaptured with the queen. Tal followed up with queen to e7, connecting his rooks. This move marked the end of the opening phase, transitioning into the middle game, which is typically characterized by tactical exchanges and attacks. Moreover, Tal's queen to e7 had a dual purpose. Not only did it connect his rooks, but it also formed a battery with the dark squared bishop, enabling Black to exchange the bishops on a3. By trading bishops, White's position would be left with weaknesses on certain squares that Black could exploit. White then moved the rook to d1, occupying a semi-open file. Tal advanced pawn to b5, preventing White's knight from jumping to c4. In chess, it is crucial to limit the mobility of your opponent's pieces. By restricting their movement, you reduce their potential to launch effective attacks, and this is precisely what Mikhail Tal achieved. The pawn to b5 move not only prevented the knight from jumping to c4, but also curtailed the activity of White's rook, leaving it in a less active and more restricted position. Next, White advanced pawn to h4, intending to reposition the bishop to a more strategic square. Tal recognized that with the rook no longer on a1, Black could expand his pawn majority on the queen side. He played pawn to a5 with the intention of pushing further. If Black succeeded in opening the queen side, it would spell significant trouble for White. In response to Tal's threat, White played pawn to c3. The idea was that if Black continued pushing the pawn to a4, White would respond with pawn to b4. However, Tal refrained from rushing his pawn push and instead moved his knight to b6. White then played rook to e1, creating space for the knight to maneuver to e3. Mikhail Tal made a brilliant move, queen to e6, pressuring the pawns on the queen side. The plan was clear. If white followed through with knight to f1, black would push pawn to a4. After the pawns exchanged, black's rook would capture on a4, and the pawn on a2 behind it would inevitably fall, giving black a one-pawn advantage. In the original game, white responded to Tal's threat by moving the queen to f5, offering a queen exchange. Tal rejected this with knight to g4, putting pressure on the f2 pawn alongside the bishop. If white captured the queens, black could recapture with the pawn. This would activate black's rooks and increase the pressure on white's weak pawn on f2. Therefore, white protected the pawn with rook to e2. Tal then placed his rook on d8, neutralizing the knight's movement. Since the rook on e2 was protecting the pawn, the rook on d1 became unprotected, and Tal took advantage of this. At this point, the best move for white would have been to place the rook on e1 to strengthen the pawn's defense and remove the pin on the knight. However, white made a less accurate move by playing bishop to f3, threatening to capture black's knight. But instead of saving his knight, Tal moved his rook to d3. Naturally, black wouldn't give up his knight for free, because if white captured the knight with the bishop, black would capture the pawn on d4, delivering a check. This pawn couldn't capture the rook because it was pinned by the bishop. So white moved the king to h2, and black's rook captured the bishop. Here, black regained a piece and gained a pawn as a bonus. This is why white didn't dare capture the knight, instead moving the king to g2. Now, the f2 pawn was no longer pinned by the bishop, and black's knight on g4 was under threat from the bishop. A typical player would save the knight by moving it to f6, but not Mikhail Tal. He played knight captures on the pawn, attacking the rook on d1. White had no choice but to capture the knight with the rook. Then, black's bishop captured the rook, and white's king recaptured the bishop. At this point, Tal exchanged his two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn. Next, Tal repositioned his queen to d6, increasing pressure on white's knight. Of course, the knight couldn't move because the rook on d1 could be captured by black. So, black reinforced the knight's position with the bishop to c1. Here, black could have checked with the queen to c7. After the king moved to g2, black's rook could capture a pawn and attack the dark-squared bishop. However, Tal seemed determined to keep up the pressure. So he played the pawn to g6, attacking white's queen. White responded with queen to g5, and then black played pawn to f6, once again threatening the queen. After white's queen moved to h6, Tal continued his attack with pawn to f5. This pawn could not be captured because if white dared to capture it, black's rook would capture the bishop, delivering check. If white captured the rook with the knight, black's queen would capture the rook on d1, resulting in a deadly attack. So white's king took the rook. Then Tal played queen to d3, delivering check. The king moved to g2, and Tal played queen to e2, again giving check. White's king moved to h3. Then, black could capture the pawn on f5, threatening checkmate with the rook maneuvering to h2. Meanwhile, white's rook was threatened by black's queen. If white tried to save the rook by moving it to h1 to avoid checkmate, black could play rook to h5, trapping the queen. This is why in the original game, white didn't dare capture the pawn, instead moving the king to g2 to avoid a file with the rook. Then, Mikhail Tal made a brilliant move. He exchanged his rook for white's light-squared bishop. If white recaptured with the king, it would worsen their position. So, reluctantly, white captured the rook with the knight, and Tal gained the rook on d1. This was a truly extraordinary tactic by Mikhail Tal. Next, white placed the knight on g5, threatening checkmate with queen capturing the pawn. But after black moved the queen to h5, white conceded. By playing queen to h5, Tal forced white to exchange queens. With a material advantage in pieces and an extra pawn, it would be very easy for black to win, especially considering his opponent was Mikhail Tal, who rarely made mistakes in the endgame. Alright, that's all for today's video. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next chess video.